really into clocks and clock batteries. Anyway, James, would you pray us in? Thanks, James. And welcome everybody in the auditorium and online. It's good to have you. And as we mentioned last week, we are going back into the Old Testament and we're going to start a study of the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. First of all, they originally were not two books. They were one big book on a scroll, and if it fell out of the library shelf, it crushed you to death. It was that kind of thing. Apparently, it must have been that way because when they translated from Hebrew to Greek, that's when they made the decision to split it into two books, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel. So 2 Samuel is not the exciting sequel to 1 Samuel, or at least not originally. 1st and 2nd Samuel, and we're starting on 1st. And the book, not necessarily written entirely by Samuel, because Samuel dies late in the first book, around chapter 25. So, but I think it's safe to say he contributed a material amount to the book, and then of course whoever put the book together, they decided to let's keep naming it Samuel just as a tribute to the man, because he was an awesome figure, and he was, as we're about to find out. But to begin our study of 1 Samuel, we need to kind of step back a couple of books in the Old Testament to try to get a proper understanding of what's going on here in the background. And so to really understand where we are in 1 Samuel, we need to go back into Judges. And in fact, the very last verse of the last chapter of the book of Judges says, "In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit." Well, gee, that sounds pretty good. This is America. We like to do as we see fit, right? But, keep in mind, this is a nation that was chosen by God and had a pretty good deal, had a covenant with God, saying, if you obey my laws, you will prosper. If you rebel against me, if you don't obey my laws, bad things will happen. And in fact, if you go back, and one thing you might want to do is to go back and read the book of Judges. If you haven't done it ever, or if you haven't done it lately, go back and read that book sometime this week. You'll see that there's this cycle that goes on. With the Israelites starting out, hey, we're God's people. We'll be obedient, and we'll do all this good stuff. And then inevitably they start falling away. People, new generation gets born. They grow up. It's kind of like, well, it's kind of stifling to have to obey all these rules. We'll start doing what we feel is a good thing to do. And by the way, there are all these interesting other little deities out there that maybe we should kind of check out, just to be open-minded. And so what you see is this repetitive pattern. The Israelites fall away. God says, okay, if you're going to be that way, I'm going to leave you to your own devices. I'm going to withdraw my protection, at least partially, just enough so that these bad guys will come in and make your lives miserable. So you'll really get to fully experience what it's like to reject me and live out from under my protection. And that's exactly what happened. Several years would go on under this domination of the bad guys, until finally the people cry out. God hears their cry, and he gives them a judge who basically, it's kind of like the old Western series you see on MeTV. Marshall Dillon comes in, cleans up the town. It's kind of like that, only they didn't have 6 shooters back then. They had to resort to other things. But anyway, the judge cleans up the place. Israel is back in line with God wants them to do temporarily until the judge dies, and then the cycle repeats. Kind of a rinse and repeat kind of lifestyle. The only problem is that every time that you have the Israelites drifting away, it gets more and more. They drift further and further and further away from the will of God, unfortunately. And by the time you get to the end of the book of Judges, you actually have this awful civil war among the Israelites, which results with one of the tribes of Israel almost being wiped out or are doomed to extinction. And it's by a certain manipulations that they survive. But that's where Judges ends. It's not a happy place. Not a place I don't think I would want to be. Hopefully you wouldn't want to be there either. You get a little bit of respite from this situation in the book of Ruth. In fact, it's a very happy love story, as well as a very great reminder about how God watches out for his people. But after Ruth, we return you now to those thrilling days of early Israel. And so that's where we are here as we open up on chapter 1. And the narrative begins. There was a certain man from Ramathaim, a Zuphite from the hill country of Ephraim. Pay no attention to those names. They're just mind-boggling. His name was Elkanah, son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite, well, in residence only. Actually, good old Elkanah was actually a Levite. If you go back and check out, whoever wrote this made the point of dating back or certifying Elkanah's genealogy by at least 4 generations. And if you go back into First Chronicles, you'll see that these people were all Levites. Is that a contradiction? No. Levites lived throughout the land of Israel, as opposed to the other tribes which had designated areas and territories allotted to them. God said, you Levites are my special people. I'm not going to give you any land, but you'll get to live in the land of your fellow Israelites. And this is the situation. Well, Elkanah had 2 wives. One was called Hannah and the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. Yes, you see a little polygamy going on here. Polygamy basically not really authorized by God. It was tolerated in these days and times, but never with his explicit approval. It was what it was, and every time you see a polygamous marriage going on, you don't have to read too far down to start seeing that there are problems. And is there a problem here? Oh yeah, big time. Verse 3, year after year, this man, Elkanah, went up from his town to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty at Shiloh. Shiloh, at this point in time, is the worship center of the nation of Israel. This is pre-David. This is before the time where David, under the reign of David, that center worship moves to Jerusalem. But Shiloh is in the heart of Israel. It's in the hill country of Ephraim, of the land allotted to Ephraim. So Elkanah doesn't have very far to go worship at Shiloh. And there, Hophni and Phinehas, the 2 sons of Eli, were priests of the Lord. Eli was the chief priest. Hophni and Phinehas were his sons, and we're going to find out more about them in a few moments. So put those names away. We're focused here on Elkanah. Whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to his wife Peninnah and all her sons and daughters. Remember that part of the worship service back in the day, as prescribed under the law of Moses, were a series of sacrifices to be given for specific purposes. And they involved a variety of offerings, from animals to grain offerings to drink offerings. And we'll leave it there, because to talk about all the various sacrifices, we'll be here until the end of next month. But anyway, Elkanah, faithful man, from what we can see, when they go to the sacrifices, and part of the sacrifices is that you get some of that. If it's when it's a animal sacrifice, you get some of that meat back, and he shares it with his family. But verse 5, to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her, and the Lord had closed her womb. Hannah was childless, and it was not just a random situation. God is behind the details here, as we learn in verse 6. Because the Lord had closed Hannah's womb, her rival, that would be Peninnah, the other wife, kept provoking her in order to irritate her. What's going on here? What's the big deal about being, we're aware of some folks who are unable to have children. It happens, absolutely. It's especially significant here in Bible times and in Israel because two things going on. First of all, in Deuteronomy, through Moses, basically God says, as one of my blessings on you, you will produce children. You will be fertile. You will populate the land. An extension of that is to have children, lots of children, was interpreted as a sign of God's blessing. God smiled on you because you had this new baby, especially if he was a boy. Sons in this day and age were valued more than women. The opposite of that is if you weren't producing children, if you, despite your best efforts, you did not have any babies, it was a personal embarrassment. It was a personal embarrassment. And also, long range, it could spell trouble for the mother because in that day and age, remember, there's no Social Security, probably not anything along the lines of a life insurance policy or a pension or an annuity. You, as a woman, you depended on your husband, and if the husband passed, you depended on your son or your son-in-law or sons, multiple, to take care of you in your old age. If you didn't have children, you were going to be in a bad fix, or so you thought. Not only that, think about what we talked about, how about God saying and through Moses that, hey, if God smiles on you, if God blesses you, one of those blessings will be fertility. Lots of children, lots of sons and daughters. The opposite was considered to be true. If you didn't have children, that was basically God's judgment on you, maybe personally, and if not personally, it was part of a national judgment. Anyway, it was hitting Hannah pretty hard, and especially at home because the other wife in the household was making her life miserable. Verse 7, this went on year after year. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. Her husband Elkanah would say to her, Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? Gee, I know he meant well. Maybe this was not the best thing to say. But anyway, life goes on. And so we come to this time where they've come to the sacrifices and to the festivals that accompany the sacrifices. Verse 9, once when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on his chair by the doorpost of the Lord's house. In her deep anguish, in bitterness of soul, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. She was in anguish. And she's desperate enough to where she not only prays to the Lord, but she makes a bargain with him, or she offers a bargain. She says, Lord, not just Lord, but Lord Almighty, Lord of hosts, Lord of mighty armies, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son. If you'll do that, Lord, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. Lord, if you give me this son, I will give him back to you, and he will be a lifelong Nazarite. A Nazarite? What's that? Well, you may remember back, in fact, this is kind of, you see a couple of examples in the book of Judges. Nazarites are folks who made a special vow to the Lord. And usually this was for a period of time, like a year, 3 years, 5 years. And during that time, and usually it was the male who made the Nazarite, he abstained from any kind of product that grew off or that could be produced from grapes. That not only included wine, it also included, if they had it back then, grape juice. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But any grape-related product. Hey, grape pie. Sorry, couldn't have it. You'll have to get something else for dessert. Not only that, they could not participate in any kind of public mourning for the dead. Anything that where they might come in contact with the dead body, which meant, if they had a good friend or a close relative that died, very likely they were not going to be able to attend the funeral. And then, last but not least, during the term of being a Nazarite, that the Nazarite did not cut his hair. He let it grow out. Had no use at all for any kind of a razor. He just let it grow. And like I say, this was for the period that the person promised to be a Nazarite. Hannah is saying, my son will be a lifelong Nazarite, which means he will never cut his hair. You can imagine how, by adulthood, how long that hair was going to be. No razor will ever be used on his head. Verse 12, as she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Hey, good news. When you pray, you don't have to vocalize it. You don't have to pray out loud. You can pray in your heart. But that's just kind of a side note here. Hannah's praying silently, lips moving. Eli looks at her. Eli thought she was drunk. This may have been kind of a problem back in the day where people would go to the sacrifices, make their sacrifices. They'd go to the festival. They'd have a little bit too much to drink, and they would start acting sloppy. It happens. Anyway, Eli's first thought is, not around me, not in the house of worship. So he rebukes her. He says to her, verse 14, how long are you going to stay drunk? Put away your wine. Well, Hannah speaks up for herself here. Not so, my Lord. I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have a sorrowful spirit. I have not been drinking wine or beer, or that's how it's translated as beer. Other translations may be intoxicating drink. So I've not been getting drunk here on something. I've been pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I've been praying here out of my great anguish and grief. Eli answered, go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you've asked of him. May he grant your petition. She said, may your servant find favor in your eyes. Then she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer sad. Early the next morning, they arose and worshipped before the Lord, and then went back to their home at Ramah. Elkanah made love to his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. The Lord remembered her. Let's unpack that phrase real quickly, because in truth, God never forgets. That's a term that people like you and me use to try to explain God's motion here, what he is doing, and help us work through how he implements certain plans of actions, how God acts on his own timing. He never forgot Hannah. But at this point in time, God says, okay, this is the right time to answer Hannah's prayer and give her what she wants. So, in the course of time, and it wasn't necessarily a case where they go back home and a month later she discovers she's pregnant. It may have been a while. I'm sure it worked on God's timetable. It happened on his timing. But eventually, in the course of time, Hannah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel. Samuel can be interpreted, every name that you see in the Bible, it's not an incidental name necessarily. It's there for a reason. It was given to commemorate something or a special situation. Hannah names her newborn son Samuel, saying, because I asked the Lord for him, and God heard me. So Samuel means heard by God. It can also mean name of God. So Samuel is born, answered prayer. When her husband Elkanah went up with all his family to offer the annual sacrifice to the Lord and to fulfill his vow, Hannah didn't go. She said to her husband, after the boy is weaned, I will take him and present him before the Lord, and he will live there always. If you're reading the Dead Sea Scrolls add this statement where Hannah says, I have dedicated him as a Nazirite all the days of his life. Kind of reminder, this is part of the bargain I made with God, and I intend to honor it when the child is ready. Do what seems best to you, her husband Elkanah told her. Stay here until you've weaned him. Only may the Lord make good his word. And implied in that is, only may the Lord do what he promised, and by extension, only may you do what you have promised as well. So the woman stayed at home and nursed her son until she had weaned him. After he was weaned, by now he's somewhere around 2 or 3 years old, she took the boy with her, young as he was, along with a 3-year-old bull, or depending on the translation that you're reading, it could be 3 bulls, an ephah of flour and a skin of wine. Interesting. He's going to be a Nazirite, but they're going to make a sacrifice with wine anyway, and brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. When the bull had been sacrificed, they brought the boy to Eli, and she said to him, pardon me, my Lord, as surely as you live, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he will be given over to the Lord. So they worshiped the Lord there. Worship seems to be very ingrained in this family because it's mentioned 3 times in this chapter. Very, very deeply religious, very God-fearing family. And then we go into chapter 2, and this Hannah sings a song. Or actually, it's a prayer, but it's in poetic form. And it's interesting because if you compare this particular song or prayer of praise, it's very similar to something that Mary, the mother of Jesus, sings in Luke chapter 1. And one thing you might want to do when you go home and have some Bible time this week, read Luke chapter 1, verses 46 through 55. That's where Mary's song occurs, and compare that with what we're about to read here. Then Hannah prayed and said, my heart rejoices in the Lord. That's a significant statement when you think that she's making perhaps the biggest sacrifice of her life. She's been given this child, and now she's giving it up to the Lord. But she says, my heart rejoices. And in the Lord, my horn is lifted high. Horn, of course, meaning power, might, domination. My mouth boasts. I smile at my enemies, for I delight in your deliverance. Maybe she was thinking of Peninnah and all that grief she'd had to put up with her. But Hannah continues, There's no one holy like the Lord. There's no one besides you. There is no rock like our God. Do not keep talking so proudly, or let your mouth speak such arrogance, for the Lord is a God who knows. He knows us more than we realize. And by him, actions and deeds are weighed. Verses 4 through 8 is a classic of traditional Hebrew poetry. It would compare and contrast, where they make one statement and then they follow it up with a contradictory statement, just to prove what they're saying here. We see several of these. The bows of the mighty men of the warriors are broken, but those who stumbled are armed with strength. Those who were full hire themselves out for food, but those who were hungry are hungry no more. She who was barren has borne 7 children. 7. Oh, pay attention to that number. Picture of completion. But she who has had many sons pines away. The Lord brings death and makes alive. He brings down to the grave and raises up. The Lord sends poverty and wealth. He makes people poor and he makes people rich. He humbles and he exalts. He brings low and he lifts up. He raises the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap. He seats them with princes and has them inherit a throne of glory. God knows how to humble the strong and the arrogant, and he knows how to exalt the weak. That's a statement. That's a concept that is both comforting and maybe in some cases cautionary. God is in control. This is why it's always good advice to humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he will lift you up, just like James says in chapter 4. And of course, we have a song that's based on that verse. For the pillars, the foundations of the earth are the Lord's. On them he has set the world. God is in control. He will guard the feet of his faithful servants, but the wicked will be silenced in the place of darkness. It is not by strength that one prevails. Those who oppose the Lord will be broken. The Most High will thunder from heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. And then look at this verse here. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. Keep in mind, at this point, Israel has no king. What king could Hannah possibly be referring to? Perhaps this is looking ahead to the Messiah. If so, this is the first such reference, messianic reference. Well, maybe not the first such, but early on. I mean, for the first such reference, you can go all the way back to Genesis chapter 3. But here, this is especially early considering all the messianic prophecies that are to come. This is one of the earliest here. The anointed, that can be translated, in other words, in Hebrew, it's the Messiah. In Greek, it's the Christ. And with that prayer, Elkanah went home to Ramah. But the boy ministered before the Lord under Eli the priest. He's now under Eli's supervision. He's in a new environment. Barely 3 years old, but even early on, he's doing godly things. Well, the scene, we're now remaining in Shiloh and at the house of worship, at the tabernacle, but the characters shift a little bit. We still got Eli, but now we're going to look at Eli's household and the family of Eli, particularly a couple of sons of his. And the report is not good. Verse 12, Eli's sons were scoundrels. They were corrupt. And the original Hebrew for corrupt basically means they were worthless and wicked men. They had no regard for the Lord. They did not know the Lord. And that's especially troubling considering the fact that's a severe judgment when you consider that they are in line to succeed Eli as the high priest. as the religious leader of all Israel. And here's an example of what they were doing. Verse 13. Now it was the practice of the priest that whenever any of the people offered a sacrifice, the priest's servant would come with a 3-pronged fork. And I'm sure this was not a dining fork. This was probably a pretty big fork that you see when you're carving the turkey, or even bigger. They'd come with a 3-pronged fork in his hand while the meat was being boiled, and would plunge the fork into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot. Whatever the fork brought up, the priest would take for himself. This is how they treated all the Israelites who came to Shiloh. Well, gee, what's wrong with that? I thought that was part of the whole process, one of the reasons why God implemented the sacrificial system. Well, yeah, that was part of it. But there was actually 3 components to the sacrifice. Basically, you came, you offered your animal, it was slaughtered, the blood was poured out, and the meat along with the fat was cooked. Basically, it was I can't think of the word, burned away. Basically, the whole idea was that 3 components of the beef. The first part and the best part went to God. That was the part that was burned up, that was sacrificed. There was a second part that went to the priest and his family. That was how the priest and his family got fed. And then the third part, the person who offered the sacrifice kept for himself. After it was cooked, they'd go and eat. Part of the celebration. That's the way it was supposed to work. It wasn't working that way. The animal had barely been slaughtered. In fact, in a lot of cases, the meat was still raw. The priest or the priest henchman, I guess for lack of a better term, would come up and say, "Give me this meat." In fact, in some cases, they wouldn't even wait for the meat to begin cooking. They would say, give it raw. Verse 15. Even before the fat was burned, the priest's servant would come and say to the person who was sacrificing, "Give the priest some meat to roast. He won't accept boiled meat from you, but only raw." Why raw meat? Well, at the very least, maybe the priests, maybe they were hungry for fajitas or something like that. And, don't cook it that way. We'll cook it ourselves. It's also quite likely, this is speculative, but hey, with raw meat, it hasn't been cooked or prepared in any way. It's more valuable on the open market if we want to go sell it. And we want to sell it. Good heavens. This is not what God had in mind with the system of sacrifices. You used it to honor God, you used it to bless the priest, and you used it to bless yourself. Best part went to God. It wasn't working out that way. There was no telling what part eventually, if any of it, got sacrificed to God. There was no telling what portion of the meat wound up with the family. The priest made sure he got the biggest and the best part. And oh, by the way, they weren't above using a little bit of threats of intimidation, maybe even out-and-out violence. Maybe a good day at the sacrifices was if you came away without a black eye or broken teeth or something because of the violence of the priest and his associates. Especially when verse 16, the person, the poor innocent guy making the sacrifice said, "Let the fat be burned first. Let's follow the rules here, what we're supposed to do with this sacrifice. And then take whatever you want." The servant would answer, "No, hand it over now. If you don't, I'll take it by force." And I'm sure I suspect these henchmen were probably big bruisers. Kind of reinforce the threat, don't you think? Not a very happy situation. Suddenly, or over time, Shiloh began to acquire a reputation of, gee, do I really have to make a sacrifice? I'm relatively healthy right now, and I just recovered from the last one where they broke my arm. I don't know if I want to go back there. Well, this verse 17, this sin of the young men was very great in the Lord's sight, for they were treating the Lord's offering with contempt. They were giving Shiloh, they were giving sacrifices a bad name. Making sacrifices to the Lord should have been high on the priority list of any God-fearing Jewish person, but now it's becoming, oh, gee, do I really have to do that? But, verse 18, in contrast, Samuel was ministering before the Lord, a boy wearing a linen ephod, a priestly garment, even at his young age. Each year his mother made him a little robe and took it to him when she went up with her husband to offer the annual sacrifice. Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife, saying, "May the Lord give you children by this woman to take the place of the one she prayed for and gave to the Lord." Then they would go home. And oh, by the way, the Lord was gracious to Hannah. She gave birth to 3 sons, 2 daughters. Meanwhile, what's the lesson here? You can't outgive God. Whatever you give to God, He will more than pay you back. Meanwhile, the boy Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord. Now, Eli, who was very old, probably by now in his 90s, heard about everything his sons were doing to all Israel and how they slept with the women who served at the entrance to the tent of meeting. Oh, gee, if abusing the sacrifice system was not bad enough, they were sleeping around. Definitely not something that was in line with their priestly duties. So Eli said to them, "Why do you do such things? I hear from all the people about these wicked deeds of yours. No, my sons, the report I hear spreading among the Lord's people is not good. If one person sins against another, God may mediate for the offender. But if anyone sins against the Lord, who will intercede for them?" His sons, however, did not listen to their father's rebuke, for it was the Lord's will to put them to death. Basically, this was not, it might be a mistake here to read this that Eli and, Hophni and whoever, I can't remember their names now, were basically victims of circumstance. Basically, ultimately, God was giving them what they wanted. They didn't want to change. And things were so bad that their father was rebuking them for their public their public behavior. But they still refused to change. Life was good. Life was the way they wanted to live it. They didn't care about God's judgment, so God's judgment was coming. But, verse 26, the boy Samuel continued to grow in stature and in favor with the Lord and with men. Interesting how you get this, the writer keeps contrasting. On the one hand, you got Eli's family, yuck. On the other hand, you got good guy Samuel, who is doing what God wants him to do, even as a young child. Well, things finally get to the point where God begins to do something about it. Verse 27. Now a man of God came to Eli and said to him, "This is what the Lord says. Did I not clearly reveal myself to your ancestors' family, to the house of your father?" That would be Aaron, the original chief priest. When they were in Egypt under Pharaoh, I chose your ancestors out of all the tribes of Israel to be my priest, to go up to my altar, to burn incense, and to wear an ephod in my presence. I also gave your ancestors' family all the food offerings presented by the Israelites. What was wrong with this setup? Nothing. Why then do you scorn? And you here in the Hebrew, not just directed at Eli, but it's plural. Why do you, Eli, and your sons scorn my sacrifice and offering that I prescribed for my dwelling? Why do you honor your sons more than me by fattening yourselves on the choice parts of every offering made by my people Israel? Pointing the finger at Eli and saying, this is as much your sin as theirs. Yeah, they're the ones who are behaving outrageously. But hey, Eli, you're the chief priest. You're the guy in charge. You can do something. In fact, you should have done something about this by now. You have failed to do so. Oh yeah, you've had these little talks with them, but nothing else. When you should have done the something else. And now God's judgment is impending against you. Verse 30, therefore the Lord, the God of Israel, declares, I promised that members of your family would minister before me forever. But now the Lord declares, far be it from me. Those who honor me, I will honor, but those who despise me will be disdained. They'll be cut off. The time is coming when I will cut short your strength and the strength of your priestly house, so that no one in it will reach old age. Eli, you're going to be the last old guy in your family line. Think about that. And you will see distress in my dwelling. Although good will be done to Israel, no one in your family line will ever reach old age. Every one of you that I do not cut off from serving at my altar, I will spare only to destroy your sight and sap your strength. You'll become weak and blind, and all your descendants will die in the prime of life. And what happens to your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, will be assigned to you. They will both die on the same day. Then I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who will do according to what is in my heart and mind. I will firmly establish his priestly house, and they will minister before my anointed one always. Then everyone left in your family line will come and bow down before him for a piece of silver and a loaf of bread and plead, appoint me to some priestly office so I can have food to eat. What a judgment. Man, that would make me think twice about what had been going on. Don't know what was in Eli's head. But chapter 3, very quickly, the boy Samuel ministered before the Lord under Eli. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare, not many visions. One night, Eli, whose eyes were becoming so weak that he could barely see, was lying down in his usual place. The lamp of God hadn't gone out yet, and Samuel was lying down in the house of the Lord where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called Samuel. Samuel answered, here I am. And he ran to Eli and said, here I am, you called me. But Eli said, I didn't call. Go back and lay down. So he went back and lay down. Again, the Lord called Samuel, and Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, here I am, you called me. My son, Eli said, I didn't call. Go back and lie down. Now, Samuel did not yet know the Lord. The word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. A third time, the Lord called, Samuel. And Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, here I am. You called me. Then Eli realized that the Lord was calling the boy. So Eli told Samuel, go and lie down, and if he calls you, say, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. So Samuel went and lay down in his place. The Lord came and stood there. This is by no means a figment of Samuel's imagination. Came and stood there, calling as at the other time, Samuel, Samuel. Then Samuel said, speak, for your servant is listening. Then the Lord said to Samuel, see, I am about to do something in Israel that will make the ears of everyone, both ears of everyone who hears this, tingle. Tingle, in the original Hebrew, basically indicates, hey, severe judgment is coming. That's how startling the news is going to be. At that time, I will carry out against Eli everything I spoke about his family, from beginning to end. The prophecy that was made at the end of chapter 2. God says, it's coming home to roost. For I told him that I would judge his family forever because of the sin he knew about his sons. His sons blasphemed God. Basically, they treated everything with contempt. And he failed to restrain them. That was Eli's main sin. He failed to do anything to correct his sons. Therefore, I swore to the house of Eli, the guilt of Eli's house will never be atoned for by sacrifice or offering. Samuel lay down until morning, probably a sleepless night, don't you think? And then opened the doors of the house of the Lord. He was afraid to tell Eli the vision, but Eli called him and said, Samuel, my son. Samuel answered, here I am. What was it he said to you? Eli said. Do not hide it from me. Tell me. May God deal with you ever so severely if you hide from me anything he told you. New King James Version translates that as God do so to you and more also. I hope you get double what has been threatened against me if you hold anything back from me. No matter how unpleasant it is, tell me the truth. So Samuel told him everything, hiding nothing from him. Then Eli said, godly response, maybe fatalistic, he is the Lord. Let him do what is good in his eyes. And then a little bit of a prologue here. Things to come. The Lord was with Samuel as he grew up, and he let none of Samuel's words fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba, their way of what we would say something nationwide from coast to coast, they say from Dan to Beersheba, recognized that Samuel was attested as a prophet of the Lord. The Lord continued to appear at Shiloh, and there he revealed himself to Samuel through his word. And then one sentence in chapter 4 to wrap up things, and Samuel's word came to all Israel. So Samuel grows in the grace of God and becomes more and more powerful. He becomes the man of God that God intends him to be. That sets the stage for our next lesson. So if you will, please read chapters 4 through 7. That'll be some very interesting things are about to happen. Yes. So have a good week, and Lord willing, we'll be back here next Sunday.